There's a very specific moment, quiet and easy to miss, when someone who's grown used to your consistent pursuit suddenly notices its absence. And I want to walk you through exactly what happens inside them in that moment, why it produces such a predictable, almost mechanical sequence of reactions, and what you can actually expect to see unfold in the days and weeks that follow. Because this moment, small as it seems, tends to reveal more about someone's actual investment in you than months of their previous behavior ever managed to show. To understand why this specific moment carries so much psychological weight, you first have to understand what's actually been happening beneath the surface of a dynamic where one person has consistently been the pursuer while the other has settled comfortably into being pursued. This kind of imbalance rarely announces itself clearly. It develops gradually, almost invisibly, through countless small moments where one person reaches out first, suggests plans first, checks in first, expresses interest first, while the other person, often without fully realizing they're doing it, settles into a passive receiving position, enjoying the attention and effort without feeling any particular urgency to reciprocate that same energy. This arrangement can persist for a surprisingly long time, sometimes months, sometimes years, precisely because it requires nothing uncomfortable from the person being pursued. They get to enjoy connection, attention, and validation without ever having to risk vulnerability, without ever having to wonder whether their own effort would be reciprocated, without ever having to sit with the uncertainty that comes from genuinely not knowing whether someone wants them as much as they want that someone. The first thing that happens when this person suddenly notices your absence of pursuit is a kind of immediate, almost reflexive confusion, because the change disrupts an expectation so deeply ingrained that its violation registers as genuinely disorienting before it registers as anything else. They've grown accustomed to a specific rhythm, your message arriving at a certain point in the day, your suggestion of plans when enough time has passed, your consistent presence requiring nothing from them except the relatively easy task of responding when it's convenient. When this rhythm suddenly stops, the first reaction isn't typically longing or genuine reflection. It's disorientation, a kind of, wait, what happened here moment that hasn't yet processed into any clear emotional conclusion about what this absence actually means, or how they should feel about it. The second thing that happens, usually following closely behind the initial confusion, is a specific kind of testing behavior, one designed to determine whether this change is temporary or genuinely represents a lasting shift in the dynamic. This testing rarely looks like a direct, honest question about what's changed. It tends to look much smaller and more indirect, a casual message sent to see if you respond with your previous eagerness, a mention of plans they used to know you'd jump at the chance to join, a slight increase in their own engagement, specifically calibrated to see whether a small amount of effort on their part will immediately restore your previous level of pursuit. This testing phase is genuinely important to understand because how you respond during this specific window often determines whether the entire dynamic actually shifts or whether it simply reverts back to its previous, imbalanced pattern once they've confirmed their minimal effort is still sufficient to bring your full pursuit rushing back. The third thing that happens, particularly if your withdrawal continues despite their initial testing, is a specific, often uncomfortable confrontation with questions about their own value and desirability, questions they'd previously never needed to ask because your consistent pursuit had made those questions entirely unnecessary. This is a genuinely significant psychological shift because being consistently pursued, without needing to reciprocate that pursuit, allows someone to avoid ever directly confronting whether they're actually as desirable, as worthy of effort, as your behavior had been consistently suggesting they were. Your withdrawal forces this question into conscious awareness for likely the first time in the entire dynamic, and this forced confrontation, however brief or however quickly they might work to suppress it, produces genuine, often uncomfortable psychological activity beneath whatever outward composure they manage to maintain. The fourth thing that happens, and this is where the specific behavior most people are curious about actually starts to emerge, is a recalibration of effort, specifically calibrated to restore the previous dynamic with the minimum possible investment required. This might look like an increase in the frequency of their messages, more enthusiasm in their responses, more initiative in suggesting plans, all genuine shifts from their previous baseline, but shifts that are frequently calibrated specifically to the minimum threshold required to bring your attention and pursuit back, rather than representing a genuine, sustained recalibration toward actual reciprocal effort and investment. This distinction matters enormously, and we'll return to it in more detail, because recognizing the difference between genuine change and strategic minimum effort recalibration is precisely the skill that determines whether this entire situation actually resolves into something healthier or simply cycles back into the same imbalanced pattern that existed before your withdrawal began. The fifth thing that happens, particularly in cases where the person genuinely valued your attention more than their previous passive behavior suggested, involves a specific kind of anxious preoccupation that begins intruding into their daily thoughts more than they typically expect or want. They find themselves checking their phone more frequently, wondering about your activities, replaying recent interactions, searching for some explanation for the shift they've noticed. This preoccupation, when genuine, represents something different and more significant than the strategic recalibration we discussed in the previous point. It suggests actual emotional investment that had simply never been tested or activated because your consistent pursuit had made that activation unnecessary. Distinguishing between this genuine preoccupation and mere strategic recalibration requires paying close attention to consistency and depth, rather than simply the presence of increased contact or attention. The sixth thing that happens, particularly if enough time passes without your pursuit resuming, is a gradual, often reluctant reassessment of the entire relationship's actual significance in their broader life. A reassessment that genuinely wasn't necessary or even possible while your consistent pursuit provided a stable, low-effort source of connection and validation. This reassessment can move in either of two directions, and which direction it moves often reveals more about the relationship's genuine potential than any of the previous reactions we've discussed. In one direction, this reassessment leads to a genuine recognition of how much your presence actually mattered, producing authentic, sustained behavioral change built on real reflection rather than strategic minimum effort recalibration. In the other direction, this reassessment simply confirms that your role in their life was primarily convenient rather than genuinely significant, leading them to accept your absence relatively quickly and redirect their attention toward whatever or whoever else can provide similar convenience with similarly minimal required investment. In one direction, this reassessment leads to a genuine recognition of how much your presence actually mattered, producing authentic, sustained behavioral change built on real reflection rather than strategic minimum effort recalibration. In the other direction, this reassessment simply confirms that your role in their life was primarily convenient rather than genuinely significant, leading them to accept your absence relatively quickly and redirect their attention toward whatever or whoever else can provide similar convenience with similarly minimal required investment. And this is exactly where I want to take the rest of our conversation, because understanding these 6 reactions is only useful if you also know how to interpret them accurately, how to respond wisely as they unfold, and how to protect yourself from the specific traps this situation tends to create for the person who finally, bravely, stopped chasing. The first thing worth understanding about actually navigating this situation well is recognizing that the initial response, whatever form it takes, rarely tells you the whole story, and reacting too quickly to that initial response often undermines the clarity your withdrawal was actually designed to produce. If their first reaction is a burst of renewed attention, resist the immediate temptation to interpret this as definitive proof that everything has changed and rush back into your previous pattern of full, enthusiastic pursuit. Similarly, if their first reaction seems like indifference or minimal engagement, resist concluding immediately that this confirms the relationship never mattered. Because sometimes genuine reassessment takes longer to develop than the first few days or even weeks might suggest. The information that actually matters tends to emerge over a longer window, requiring patience precisely at the moment when patience feels hardest to maintain. The second thing worth understanding is how to distinguish genuine, sustained behavioral change from the strategic minimum effort recalibration we discussed extensively in the first part of this conversation, because this distinction is genuinely the most important skill for correctly interpreting what's actually happening. Genuine change tends to be consistent regardless of your own response to it. It continues, deepens, and expands even when you don't immediately reward it with full pursuit resumed, because it stems from authentic internal reflection rather than strategic calculation about the minimum required to restore your previous behavior. Strategic recalibration, by contrast, tends to be remarkably responsive to your own reactions, intensifying when you show signs of returning to your previous pattern and quietly receding the moment they sense their minimal effort has successfully restored the status quo. Watching how their behavior responds specifically to your own continued restraint, rather than simply noting that some change has occurred, gives you significantly more reliable information than the mere presence of increased effort ever could on its own. The third thing to understand is how to manage your own internal experience during this uncertain waiting period, because this waiting genuinely tends to be one of the most psychologically difficult parts of the entire process, regardless of how confident you felt in your initial decision to stop pursuing. You'll likely experience real uncertainty about whether you're doing the right thing, real temptation to reach out just once more, real anxiety about whether your restraint is actually producing anything meaningful, or whether you're simply losing someone who might have eventually reciprocated if you'd only remained patient a little longer with your previous pattern. This discomfort doesn't mean your approach is wrong. It means you're genuinely changing a pattern that had become deeply ingrained. And genuine change of any ingrained pattern typically feels uncomfortable, specifically because it requires overriding automatic behaviors your nervous system had grown accustomed to executing without much conscious deliberation. The fourth thing worth exploring is what to actually do if their reassessment moves in the positive direction, producing genuine, sustained reciprocal effort rather than mere strategic recalibration. Because this positive outcome still requires careful, thoughtful navigation rather than an immediate, uncomplicated return to full pursuit on your part. Even when genuine change appears to be occurring, it's worth continuing to observe consistency over an extended period before fully returning to your previous level of investment, because a single positive shift, however genuine it initially appears, doesn't yet constitute the kind of reliable, sustained pattern that would justify the same level of vulnerability and effort you'd previously extended without requiring reciprocal evidence first. This isn't about playing games or manufacturing artificial scarcity. It's about learning, perhaps for the first time in this specific dynamic, to extend your own effort proportionally to demonstrated, sustained reciprocity, rather than extending it unconditionally, regardless of what you're actually receiving in return. The fifth thing worth understanding is what to actually do if their reassessment moves in the negative direction, confirming that your role in their life was primarily convenient rather than genuinely significant, because this outcome, while painful, actually represents valuable, clarifying information rather than a failure of your approach. If someone genuinely doesn't reciprocate meaningful effort once your own pursuit stops, this reveals something important and true about the actual unsubsidized state of the relationship. information that your previous consistent pursuit had been effectively concealing by artificially maintaining a connection that wasn't actually sustained by mutual investment. This confirmation, however painful in the moment, protects you from continuing to invest in a dynamic that would have eventually produced this same disappointing conclusion, regardless of how long you continued carrying it alone, simply delaying the inevitable recognition rather than preventing it entirely. The sixth thing, and this deserves particular attention because it's often overlooked in conversations focused primarily on the other person's reactions, is understanding what this entire process reveals about your own patterns, separate from whatever specific outcome unfolds with this particular relationship. If you find yourself in this exact dynamic repeatedly across different relationships, always finding yourself as the primary pursuer, while others settle comfortably into passive reception of your effort, this pattern deserves examination beyond simply the specific relationship currently prompting your reflection. It might suggest a broader tendency to seek validation through pursuit itself, finding a kind of security in being the one who reaches out, who initiates, who maintains the relationship's momentum, precisely because this role, while exhausting, doesn't require you to risk the vulnerability of waiting to see whether someone else will choose to pursue you with equal enthusiasm. I want to say something important here about what stopping the chase actually protects. Beyond simply generating clarifying information about this specific relationship's genuine state, every time you stop extending unreciprocated pursuit, you're protecting something fundamental about your own sense of worth and your own relationship with vulnerability itself. Continuing to pursue someone who never reciprocates that pursuit, however unconsciously, tends to reinforce a belief that your value depends on your continued effort, that you have to keep earning attention and connection through relentless initiative rather than simply being someone whose presence is naturally, mutually desired without requiring constant proof of your own investment. Stopping the chase, even when it produces genuine uncertainty and discomfort, begins dismantling this belief, replacing it gradually with a more accurate, more sustainable understanding that genuine connection shouldn't require you to be the sole engine keeping it alive indefinitely. I also want to address something honestly about the specific fear that often accompanies this decision, the fear that stopping your pursuit will simply cause the entire relationship to quietly end, confirming your worst suspicions about how little you actually meant to this person throughout the dynamic. I want to be honest about this fear rather than dismissing it, because sometimes, yes, this is exactly what happens. But I want you to understand why this outcome, however painful, actually represents valuable information rather than a failure of your approach. A relationship that ends the moment you stop being the sole source of its maintenance was likely already functioning on borrowed time, sustained only by your effort rather than genuine mutual investment. And discovering this now protects you from continuing to invest in something that would have eventually reached this same conclusion regardless of how much longer you continued carrying it entirely alone. I want to say something directly now to anyone listening who's currently in the exact position we've spent this entire conversation examining, watching with real uncertainty to see what happens now that you've finally, bravely, stopped being the only one putting in effort. Whatever happens next, whether it produces genuine, sustained reciprocity or confirms that this specific relationship was never as mutual as your own consistent effort had made it appear, you're already doing something genuinely important simply by allowing this information to surface clearly, rather than continuing to obscure it through your own relentless, unreciprocated pursuit. This clarity, however it ultimately resolves, is worth far more than the comfortable uncertainty of never actually testing whether your effort was ever genuinely matched. So picture this, the way we often close these conversations, not a dramatic confrontation, not a calculated game designed to manipulate a specific outcome, but something quieter, something that reflects how this kind of clarity actually tends to unfold in real, ordinary life. Picture yourself In the days and weeks following your decision to finally stop chasing, watching closely but without anxious desperation, simply observing what naturally happens when your own effort no longer artificially sustains a connection that may or may not have ever been genuinely mutual. Picture the specific, grounding relief that comes, regardless of which direction the outcome ultimately moves, of finally knowing something true and clear, rather than continuing to wonder, continuing to doubt yourself, continuing to invest energy into a dynamic whose actual nature you'd never allowed yourself to fully, honestly examine. Because that is the real, quiet, cinematic truth beneath everything we've explored today. This person noticing you've stopped chasing was never actually about a clever strategy designed to manipulate them into wanting you more. It was about finally allowing the truth of this specific relationship to surface clearly. Without the distortion your own consistent effort had been unintentionally creating for however long this dynamic had persisted. And whether their reaction ultimately confirms a connection worth continuing to nurture, or reveals one that had already, quietly, become something you were sustaining entirely alone. Either outcome gives you something invaluable that continued unreciprocated pursuit never could have provided. The simple, grounding clarity of finally knowing exactly where you actually stand, and exactly how to move forward from a foundation of truth, rather than from the exhausting, unsustainable work of hoping that truth might eventually turn out to be something other than what it actually already is.